to put you on the spot like that for a moment. So tonight we have Dan Sweeney, who is from the D-Lab. He provides technical assistance to scale-up partners and performs lab and field-based research and development on biomass and waste conversion processes. And after finishing a PhD at the University of Utah, he moved to Sweden for a Fulbright fellowship focused on the development of advanced processes for converting biomass residues to energy and fuel. And so he's going to present a little bit about the D-Lab and some of that work tonight.
Andrew? Thank you guys. Thanks a lot, everybody. Good to be here at E4 Dev. I've been coming to these meetings for a while, and a lot of really good content discussion, so happy to be contributing. I think this is the first D-Lab presentation here. So I'll give a little bit of background on D-Lab before we get started. But the topic here is on my work I've been doing at D-Lab for the past year, and it's focused on scaling clean household fuels, and mostly in East Africa at this point. D-Lab, the D is development through design, dissemination, and dialogue. A bunch of D's there. But essentially we work on appropriate technologies for use in developing contexts. So that ranges from agriculture to solar lanterns to ICT to fuels in this case. And I think traditionally D-Lab at MIT, it's been around for about 10 years, and it's traditionally been mostly a teaching lab. So we teach courses to mostly undergraduate students and give those students kind of a hands-on experience engaging with a community in a developing country and helping to address a need that that community has. Part of the point of this talk tonight will be to kind of address a stigma that I think D-Lab has had, and I'm not going to shift away too much on this, but I think in the past, and from what people have told me, is that D-Lab is a place where students come, they take a class, they develop a prototype, and they go on a trip over IAP or the summer and implement that prototype in a community, and then maybe nothing ever happens with it again. And part of the work that I'm doing in the Scale Ups program at D-Lab is directly meant to address that and seek continuity in the projects that we do, so they're not just one-off solutions. Anyway, let us continue. To kind of frame this story that I'm going to tell you, we're going to focus on a particular place. We're going to kind of weave a thread through this story, all based around this one place that I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time, and that's Soroti, Uganda. It's a small, relatively small town. It's about 50,000 people in northeast Uganda. Pretty flat, fairly dry, right next to a big lake and river system that emanates from Lake Victoria and carries on through the Nile. It's mostly agriculture based, so most of the population in the areas around Soroti are subsistence farmers or small commercial farmers. But it does have kind of a bustling town center, and there's a lot of commerce, there's a lot of construction, a lot of goods passing through. And you can feel that it's kind of a hotbed for development and innovation. And in Soroti, we have a great partner and a good friend. This is Betty Ikalani. And some of you may have heard of Betty already. She's like establishing quite a name for herself. She was here at MIT a few months back and was speaking with a few different groups. But Betty grew up in Soroti, just in a little village outside of Soroti, an agricultural area. And she was privileged enough to be able to go away for education. And she was educated for most of her life in the Netherlands. But what's different about Betty is she was kind of inspired to go back to her community. So we see her here now. She lives in kind of a peri-urban area just outside of the town center. And she's here with her son Noel. So she was motivated to return to her community because she saw that there were a lot of needs that need to be addressed there. And I'll kind of run through those really quickly. And a lot of this comes from conversations that I've had with Betty. One of those things is that Uganda, in comparison to the U.S. here, is a very young country. most of the population is under the age of 20. And it's one of the fastest growing populations too. So the challenge that this presents is you're going to have a lot of young people who are seeking employment. And there's really not a very good system to introduce those people to employment and prepare them. The education system is kind of lacking in that respect. This was one challenge that Betty saw. The next was that people in many parts of the world, but particularly in East Africa, rely on solid biomass fuels to meet most of their energy needs. So in East Africa, it's well over 95%. I think it's in Uganda, it's 98%. A lot of that is firewood, because populations are generally rural, so people will go out and gather firewood or go to a central market and gather firewood. There are a few other problems that kind of correlate to this, and that's indoor air quality and health effects resulting from inhalation and smoke. It's now the biggest killer in the world. Respiratory complications from indoor air quality kills about 4 million people a year. So she saw that problem. On the environmental side, it transfers over to deforestation. We know a bit about this, but East Africa in particular, due to the fast-growing populations there, the unavailability of alternative forms of energy like electricity or LPG. Most people are depending on the forests for energy and clearing land to seek out opportunities for agriculture. So when we look at kind of fuels in particular, and this is where we're going with Betty and her approach at solving some problems in her community. Typically, people in rural areas are deforesting land and producing wood charcoal, among other things like timber and just clearing land for agricultural use. But here we see traditional wood charcoal production. Basically, you chop down a tree, hack it up into a bunch of smaller pieces, pile those up, start a fire, and then bury that and let that fire kind of smolder for a week to 2 weeks. Come back, unbury it, and you have a pile of wood charcoal, which then you can transport through this pretty complex supply chain into an urban area where urban populations use these for cooking. It's very inefficient and it's very dirty. It produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. 5 kilograms of wood are needed to produce about 1 kilogram of charcoal. So when we look at wood charcoal in terms of kind of climate impact, it's very significant. And it's also kind of devastating on local environment. That wood charcoal ends up in urban areas where it's sold in large market centers. So, and it's not just unique to East Africa. D-Lab started working in this area in Haiti mostly, where about 2% of the original forest remains. A lot of that attributed to wood charcoal consumption. But people rely on it, and there's really not a good alternative at this point. So Betty kind of banded together with some of her local friends who were also kind of driven toward social improvement. And they said, well, we want to try to address this problem of fuels. And what they did is they started gathering dung. So they'd gather cow dung or goat dung, mix that with clay, and make these little briquettes that we see here. And then they would take those in pails and sell them in the market. And they were really feeling pretty good. That's what Betty was telling me. She said, we're introducing an alternative, people are buying it, we're earning a little bit of money, but she was kind of hungry for something more. So now we'll shift over to MIT and D-Lab. So D-Lab, founded by Amy Smith, who some of you may know, great inventor, brilliant woman, great educator now too. She, in the early days of D-Lab, she had been to Haiti and was introduced to this problem of wood charcoal, and she was kind of inspired to come up with a technology to address it. So we call it the $30 charcoal factory. A farmer who's producing some kind of agricultural waste can take that waste and carbonize it, pyrolyze it, and produce charcoal in a repurposed oil drum, which you can pretty much find anywhere. Then you take the char powder produced from that process, mix it with some binder, and use a hand press which we have one up here, you can try it out later. Made from readily available steel, a lot of times scrap steel, for about $2. And a farmer and his family or a group of farmers can band together and start producing these little charcoal briquettes from their farm waste. So things like corn cobs and rice husks and coconut shells. And in Haiti, where Amy started introducing this, farmers were kind of flocking to this idea. They were able to recoup their capital investment within about a month after producing briquettes from their mostly sugarcane bagasse. This was great. We continued and DLAB developed this whole methodology and disseminated a lot of educational materials and YouTube videos. And it started reaching people outside of just Haiti and over in Africa. We won't really walk through all this process again, but it's, essentially take the agricultural waste, carbonize it in a 55-gallon drum. That takes maybe 30 minutes to an hour. You take the char, mix it with a binder made from a starchy root vegetable, either yucca or cassava usually. Use your $2 briquette press to hand press it into briquettes. Let the briquettes sun dry, and after a few days, you've got a briquette that you can take and use in your own home or sell in market. We called it fuel from the fields. And more content that we generated for that. And we found that there was some correlation here between the material that you used and the quality of charcoal briquettes that you got. So people tended to be more satisfied with materials like maize cobs or coconut shells, which had low ash content, low inorganic content, and a higher fixed carbon content. So basically something that mimicked something more like wood charcoal. So we tended to emphasize that people use things like maize cobs or coconut shells or sawdust as opposed to rice husks, but certainly any of these can be used. Moving along. So Betty and her group in Uganda catch wind of this. They call themselves Chesso Women's Development Initiatives. They end up seeing, I think they saw Amy's YouTube video on how to make charcoal from farm waste. And Betty saw an opportunity in the huge amount of groundnut shells in their community. So groundnuts are kind of like peanuts. And they accumulate huge masses of these during harvest and processing season. So Betty started gathering these up, and together they started producing charcoal briquettes from these materials. And they convinced at one point in time, they convinced Amy Smith to come visit and see what they'd been doing. Amy was inspired by what Betty and her friends had taken on here and the fuels that they were producing. So we went back to DLAB and started thinking about, how do we reach more people like Betty, and how do we help them scale up? Because obviously, if you give them an idea, they can run with it and do more than we ever imagined. So back at Scale Ups, we were asking the question, and this is before I'm around, but they were asking the question, what technology and business model would benefit from DLAB's expertise? What can we kind of plug into? What's ready for us to tap into in terms of technical expertise and business expertise? Give it that extra nudge to take off and scale up. And we were looking for some criteria in particular, high impact. We wanted to save people money and improve their livelihoods, create jobs and income for especially rural communities and smallholder farmers, and offer health benefits and environmental benefits as well. And the unique thing about charcoal briquettes is they kind of offer all of these things. It's something that can be produced, in a rural community or in an urban community. It doesn't require a lot of machinery or foreign investment or anything, or a lot of capital to get started at. And people can earn money immediately, and people who aren't employed can gain employment. So we decided, or Scale Ups decided to choose briquettes as sort of their first test case in plugging into a local economy and offering some support. And through that, we started this Harvest Fuel Initiative. So this was a joint effort that I spend most of my time working on now between D-Lab and the Charcoal Project. Charcoal Project is a kind of advocacy group for charcoal and the problem of wood charcoal and solutions, and also kind of policy advisors for that. So we decided to focus in on East Africa. We had a limited amount of staff at D-Lab, limited amount of staff at the Charcoal Project, and a little bit of resource to put toward this. So we looked at East Africa and we selected 4 enterprises in Uganda and Tanzania that we would support with some financial input, very small amount, and technical support and business mentoring and coaching. And it was kind of a unique program because these weren't really opportunities that were available to these enterprises before. So 3 in Uganda, 2 of these, 2D and this group Nakabale, are serving kind of smaller communities, small towns. I think this community is about 20,000 people, and Soroti is about 60,000. Green Bioenergy is serving the Kampala market, so very big charcoal consumer market. And RD Energy, which is a sister company to RD India, Appropriate Rural Technology Institute, is serving the Dar es Salaam market, which is massive. So who are they and how are they selected? These are social enterprises producing solid biomass fuels. They had to have a social mission, so they couldn't just be profit-driven. Benefiting the environment, employing local people, alleviating poverty. They had to have this kind of integrated approach: sustainable feedstocks, efficient conversion, and efficient use. But we didn't really know what that was at the point, and that's part of what we're working on now. Scalable or replicable, in that we can take the successes or failures of these enterprises and sort of broadcast those to the rest of the charcoal briquetting world and try to replicate those successes in other places. And we wanted early stage, but not startup. So people who had been involved in this a bit, but hadn't built up so much or hadn't built up a lot of capacity investment to where they didn't really need us. Again, leadership and management are important. People like Betty who can drive this forward and sustain it. And then politically stable environments, of course, makes it easy for me and students at ULab to go there. And then using appropriate technology. So that's kind of like scaling up within your means. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So in general, for the 4 enterprises that I've outlined, they follow 2 different business models. So in the case of 2D up in Soroti, the smaller one, they're using what we call a centralized approach. So they take raw waste that they gather from local farms, or in the case of groundnut shells, these local processing mills. They gather that waste and transport it back to their production site, which is basically Betty's backyard. They carbonize the waste in these oil drums, these repurposed oil drums, and the staff are quite skilled in doing that. So these are running all the time. They then use their hand presses and press the char and binder into briquettes, and then dry those out in the sun. So the other approach is decentralized, and this is what the group in Tanzania is following. And what their approach is to train farmers on how to do this carbonization step. So they work with local farmers and farm groups to operate the kilns. So they're transforming their waste into char, adding value to that. So then RD comes around with a lorry or a truck and buys the waste from the farmers and transports it back to their processing facility. The farmer's happy, he's taking something that he otherwise burned or discarded in the field, and he's earning some money from it. RD then processes it kind of like 2D does. They have a little bit more sophisticated machinery, they're a little bit bigger scale. But after maybe 5 to 10 days of drying, they have a product that they can sell. We actually have a bag of it here, so if you want to come check it out afterwards. There's some business challenges and there's obviously some technical challenges, which is where us at HFI, at D-Lab, plug in and help out. I'm not going to go through all these, but there are advantages to being rural, like 2D, where you have ready access to the feedstock. So they saw that centralized approach make more sense. But for somebody like Artie in Dar es Salaam, they want to densify the material before they transport it back. So they want access to customers, and they don't want to have to cover those big transport costs. For technology, this is a particularly big problem for a lot of the producers. If they're focusing on low tech, it's great because it doesn't require much investment, but you need a lot of people. You know, when you're operating a hand press and trying to scale up, basically scales linearly with people. If we can afford the high technology, the machinery, automated machines for making briquettes, it enables us to scale up quite quickly, but it requires a big capital investment. The other really important one that I had never really thought about before coming and getting involved in this was market acceptance. Just like we aren't so readily willing to switch to a new product. Say if you're used to cooking with a gas stove and you have to cook with an electric stove, that's kind of a hassle. The people in these markets are the same. So even though something may be a little cheaper, which in many cases the briquettes are compared to other fuels, people are very critical of these. So any little difference or something that they don't like, it emits a little bit more smoke, they're very quick to reject it and stop using it. And then word of mouth is very powerful. So if one user is dissatisfied, they'll tell 10 of their friends, and then you have 10 dissatisfied users. So this has come up to be very important, especially as the enterprises scale up. The technical challenges, which I focus on mostly, kind of all, they range from the initial stage of production where you're gathering feedstock, which is very low density and spatially dispersed. So that's a challenge. Char processing to make briquettes is a challenge because you can think of char like sandpaper. So as you, say, extrude it through a machine, it basically wears away any weak material there. And materials are a significant problem. Importing good technology or higher quality technology from Europe is challenging because of the capital cost, obviously. Another big issue is weather. So, especially in the drying step, when you put the briquettes out to dry under the sun, the rainy season offers a big challenge and basically shuts down a lot of these smaller operations. And then again, this uniform and consistent products. What is quality, and is it really important? Well, yeah, we're finding out that it is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the value that people here at MIT have been able to add to these users on the ground. And it was a little ambiguous to me in the beginning that we could even add value. Like, how do I, sitting here in a lab in Cambridge, try to come up with solutions for people who are being challenged every day by new things? So it's been a bit of a struggle, but we're finding out a good system for doing this. And part of that is I go spend a lot of time with it, which is okay with me. So one of the issues that we've been helping the producers with is drying technology. So here at Artie, Tanzania, they dry the briquettes on these wire mesh racks. But of course, in rainy season, you get intermittent rain, and it's difficult to dry them continuously, so they cover with tarps. So we've devised a prototype over the summer. It's basically a solar thermal forced air drying cabinet. And it utilizes a solar thermal panel and this cabinet with a fan at the top. And we're initially finding that it works a bit better during rainy season especially than the drying racks, but needs some more work. So the nice thing is that we can get some continuity on these projects. So introducing these challenges to students and letting them kind of run with some ideas, then going and implementing. I'm sort of the person that maintains the solution moving forward past the class, past the IAP. This is a great story here. Over over the summer I was in Uganda, and Betty in particular, and people kind of at her scale, there's maybe probably about a dozen different enterprises in Uganda who are producing about a ton per day of briquettes. And that we consider kind of in this medium range, where there's not really a good technology solution for making briquettes. At the small scale, you have the hand press. The big scale, you can import machines from India or China to do that. But what a lot of people use, like Betty, is they take a meat grinder, meat mincer, and modify that so you can extrude briquettes out of the end of it. These are often made out of cast iron or cast aluminum and just don't last. So Betty basically replaces this machine every month. And they cost about $200 a piece, so it's not really sustainable. So we've been kind of ideating and brainstorming on this for quite a while, and I ended up meeting this guy, Katende, in Kampala. And he claims, I can build you a machine that's better than the meat mixer. Obviously, Betty can't afford to import a machine from India or China, so we said, okay, let's give Katende a machine a try. So this kind of ties into another one of DLab's philosophies, which is, work with the people rather than for the people. Right? So Katende is a local innovator that we're working with to build this improved extruding machine. He also has this really cool outfit from the New Jersey Department of Corrections. I don't think he's part of that. So another issue that's come up is quality control. I think I mentioned that. The pot of beans cooks in 1 hour 1 week, and then they cook with briquettes the next week, and it takes an hour and a half. People are very dissatisfied. So when the enterprises came to me and said, consumers often complain briquettes perform differently 1 week to the next, my thought was, well, we need some kind of quality control, quality assurance process. But how do you do that at a very rudimentary production site? They don't have a quality assurance lab. There's no engineers there. So we devised these simple tests that they can run, and kind of went out in the field and trained them on how to do these things, like measuring density and doing what we call a water boil test, basically timing the amount of time it takes to boil 5-liter saucepan of water. In some cases, like with George here up at the Nakavali group, George didn't finish school. He quit after primary school, so we had to cover kind of basic arithmetic with him before he could go and do a density calculation, which was a lot of fun, and he was very inspired after that, as you can see. But we essentially have now 4 little labs set up in the field, and the groups do these quality measurements every few days with each batch of briquettes they produce. Then they go on and they learn how to use Google Drive or Google Docs, so they can upload that quality data so that I can tie into it and help them to monitor those measures. So we see density with time here, and they're kind of dialing in on a more stable density profile, and their water boil test results here, fuel consumption for the water boil test. The other great thing about this is it allows me to run experiments. So if we want to try a different mixture of say, charcoal made from groundnut shells and some made from coconut husk, whatever happens to be available, they're now equipped with the tools to kind of test and evaluate their products themselves. So it's sort of like crowdsourcing research a little bit for me. The other thing we do a lot of at DLab, and I could probably spend an entire talk on just this, so I had to really cut it down. And unfortunately, I can't give a whole lot of results without going into a lot of the background. But we're doing a lot of lab and field testing. Mostly this is to ensure that the products that these producers make are suitable for the users, and they match up kind of to what users expect. So we go out in the field and evaluate the products for emissions and efficiency, and also, just to kind of quantify safety and health effects as well. There's really not a lot of data that exists out there. And we have a cook stove test lab now at DLab where we can run tests on the stoves. this is a guy, so this is another program that D-Lab does where we bring in a designer in residence. So this is a guy from Uganda who came to D-Lab. It was kind of like a playground for him. He could build whatever he wanted. He could talk to people who were experienced in the area. So we ran some tests on his no-cost brick book. So we kind of iterated some design for that. We'll have a few pretty solid data sets and papers coming out pretty soon. So we're studying, in addition to kind of performance and efficiency and emissions of these fuels and stoves, we're also looking at kind of the science behind combustion of charcoal and wood fuels in simple cook stoves. So we've partnered with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We did this really intensive campaign over the summer where we measured a lot of very difficult things to measure. For one, ultrafine particulate and black carbon, which is a significant climate force in the agent, organic aerosols, which play an important role in regional air quality. So we're looking at the science behind a lot of this too. And the other thing we're doing recently is we've tied into a global effort to develop standards for cook stoves and cooking fuels. And this is meant to set some metrics, basically, that stoves have to meet in order to be, say, certified by this ISO standard. So it's good to have the fuels community and people tied into real producers in this ISO conversation. We've done, to sort of validate some of the lab testing, we've done also some consumer research. Or I should say that the research is being validated by the lab testing. So we've gone out into the communities that these 4 enterprises are serving and done some consumer interviews. And generally you can see that people are overall pretty satisfied with the alternative fuels, the charcoal briquettes that they're using. They produce more heat and more ash, which maybe isn't as good a thing, less smoke and less cooking time. Good, right? But what we found with some of the testing is that people tend to report more favorably when you're there interviewing them. So I think the lab and field tests are bringing a lot more information to us. So I'm going to finish up here, and I'm happy to take a lot more questions. But I'll close with a few slides that ask, is this working? We've now been, the Harvest Fuel Initiative has been supporting these enterprises for about 2 years. Is this a good model to scale up an appropriate technology, a new product in a developing market? So if we look at it, right, Betty has a new machine that she's using. She's bought a lorry for herself, and she's built a nice new drying rack. So it looks like she's doing a lot better, but maybe that's just time that's giving that. If we look at Green Bioenergy in Kampala, they have a really tight, nice factory where they've got high throughput machines producing about 10 tons per day of briquettes. They've got these great drying rack spaces, and they have really clean marketing and branding for their products. So they have this product Briquetti, which they market to kind of middle income households. So it looks like they're advancing as well. But when we go to the numbers, and I won't say but, because I think it tells the same story. We look at Tootie up in Sarobi, this is Betty, and we see, her fuel sales are going up. She's reached profitability since we started working with her in Q1 2013. So that was a big deal, and she's now able to invest some of that money she's earning back into the company and able to employ some more people. She's also started developing cook stoves, which I didn't talk much about, but most of the producers make their own improved cook stoves, which are contributing quite a lot to their businesses. But if we look at another case here, RD Energy in Tanzania, they've struggled a lot. They're big losses every quarter, relatively big for the businesses that they are, throughout the time that we've worked with them. There are some things to explain this, though. They've dealt with some additional struggles in that they've gone out and trained a lot of farmers on how to produce the char, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment. They've also invested in some machinery that they had built, custom built in India, and that took a long time to get there. I was talking to these guys the other day, and it took over a year just for the containers to go from India into Dar es Salaam. So there are additional challenges, but we think they'll be looking better soon. And then as far as a program, we set out some goals as far as HFI and DLAB are concerned. We want people to earn income, and we have this goal of $200,000 of cumulative income for employees in these enterprises, and we've reached that. The other one is deforestation, and we've exceeded our goal in deforestation by reducing wood fuel, or offsetting wood fuel using, is a better way to say it. And a big reason for that is that the producers are producing charcoal continuously, but they've also taken on these cook stove efforts that we've helped them develop. So that looks good too, but obviously still a lot of work to do. So with that, I will close and take any questions.